I had been pretty much an agnostic my entire life, had become a total atheist after my son died, because I was so angry when people would tell me that my son was with Jesus now, and I would scream at them, I'll tell you about your Jesus kills little children. And I did not believe in God. And even if the God did exist, I hated him. I didn't want any part of that. Growing up, I had no belief in God because I was in a dysfunctional family where alcoholic parents, we were transferred all over the country with my dad's job. We weren't allowed to speak to my father. He was a very angry, nasty man. And so my insecurities grew. And when I got into my teen years, I rebelled a lot and got into trouble, ended up getting married and having 2 little sons and a nervous breakdown by the time I was 21 years old. Of course, married to an alcoholic that was abusive, and I didn't know any different, I guess. I packed him up one time and just left from Kansas City to Seattle, moved my boys out. We got into government housing in Seattle, and I got a job, and we were pretty happy because it was like I was away from that horrible situation in Kansas City. I eventually met a man and married him, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man. He loved my 2 sons, and we were just so happy. He was handsome. He had his own home. He drove a new car. He was stable. He wasn't an alcoholic. He was kind and intelligent. Very, very handsome man. And so we had the perfect life and things were going well. But into the marriage, he purchased a business with a friend of his. It was a tavern. And I was so opposed to alcohol that it bothered me, but I couldn't stop him from his dream. Well, I never worked in the tavern, but there was one week where we had a promotion and I would work then. I kissed my 2 boys that night and I left the house, and as I walked into the tavern, it was extremely busy. So all sorts of people there. And so I couldn't figure out why Don was talking on the phone really intensely, leaning over. And pretty soon he hung up the phone and came and grabbed my arm, and we were pulling me out the door saying that my son Mark had been hit by a car. So we rushed to the hospital, and the doctor came running out asking how it had happened. And of course I didn't know. And they pulled Mark out of the ambulance and took him in, and we were led to a room where we waited an hour, just after excruciating hour. And when I walked down the hall after a while and was looking out the window, and I saw cars going by, and I couldn't figure out how a new day could be starting for people. How could it just be normal? Because what was happening in this hospital definitely wasn't normal. And I heard footsteps coming down the hall, and I turned around, and a doctor looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry, but we were unable to save Mark." And we walked into the room where he was, and he was so cold, and I pulled the covers up over him and kissed him, and I saw a tear in his eye and kissed his tear away. And I said, "Marky, everything will be all right because Mommy's here, and Mommy can fix anything, right?" And it was just so surreal to me. And I then collapsed, and I just don't remember much other than being let out of the hospital at dawn and just walking on rubbery legs and not wanting to go home because I couldn't bear to see Mark's things. But we had to. And my other son, Chris, was there at the house. He'd been with Mark when Mark was hit by the car, and everybody rushed to Mark. And so Chris was left there. He had watched the whole horrible thing and walked home and told the babysitter. So he didn't know what had happened. And he ran over to me and said, "Mommy, did you hear what happened to Mark?" And I had to tell him that the doctors weren't able to fix Marky. And so he went screaming into his bedroom, and Chris was never the same after that. It was just a horrible thing for him. So we lost Mark, and I just became reclusive then. I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't talk to people. I didn't want any part of even living anymore, just staring out the window mostly and doing just what was absolutely necessary. So that's how we lost Mark, and the state of my life then was pretty much over. The abuses that I had gone through my whole life, I never had real happiness. I had this 1 year of real happiness when I met my husband, Don. And then when Mark died, things started sliding downhill again. And all my insecurities that I had growing up all came back. And I knew that, Don was too good for me, that all these things that kind of came into my head. And So I wasn't pleasant to be around, and we started arguing, having issues in our marriage. And I think that's very common in a marriage when there's a death of a child like that. And it was a terrible time for us. Well, Don eventually wanted me to get out of the house and to try to go on with my life, but I just couldn't. And he arranged for us to go out one night. And as we started to do that, I was arguing with him, not wanting to go, and he insisted. So I remember walking out the door, and we just started picking at each other. We got in the car and we were picking at each other more and more, and started arguing. And as we drove down the highway, I was just losing all control and yelling at him, and he's yelling at me. And pretty soon he said something to the extent that, Pat, you need to move on. And I came across a seat screaming at him, and with my fist just railing into his face and saying, I'll never move on. Don't talk to me like that. I'll never move on. And I didn't want to. And he took his arm and went like this to push me over to the other side of the car. And the blow hit me in the back side of me and in my upper back. And apparently what happened was you have a sac around your liver that kind of holds this jelly-like thing working together, and it had exploded and blew my liver into several pieces, and I had massive internal bleeding. I didn't know it, of course, and when Don turned around and took us home, I said, just take me home, and he did. And as he went in the bathroom, was splashing water in his face, I took the car's keys and took off, because that's always what I did when I got frustrated or afraid. I ran, and I started feeling this pain inside of me, but I didn't know if my heart was breaking or something was really bad wrong with me. And I don't know how I got home, but I did. And I was halfway crawling up the driveway, and Don was at the door and was furious with me. And I started past him, telling him I needed to get to the hospital, that something was drastically wrong with me. So he believed me at that point and took me to the hospital. And we were in there and just waiting, and doctors were doing tests, and they didn't have CAT scans or MRIs. We're talking back in the late 60s. So all they could do is go by the blood pressure, blood count, whatever, was dropping drastically. And they knew I had internal bleeding, but didn't know why or how. And the doctor came in and asked me how I had the bruise on my back. And I didn't want to tell him, that Don had hit me, because Don was not a wife beater, and I didn't want them to think that. And I was fearful, that they would do something to him. And so I didn't say anything. And finally they came in and said, you have to go into surgery right away, and put me on the gurney. And I'm going, well, who are you guys? I was just fearful. I don't know what's happening. Am I going to die or what? What's wrong? And so there wasn't any time, for talking or discussion. And they were wheeling me down the hallway, and Don came by the gurney and leaned over and told me that he loved me. And I felt so shocked, because I didn't even think he liked me anymore, let alone loved me. And I held on to that vision when we went into the surgery, and I saw the doctors and the nurses leaning over me, and they put the mask over my face, and I knew that I should go under the anesthetic, but I didn't. I could still hear them, but everything grew really black and really dark. And then the voices stopped, and I was in a place, and I couldn't breathe, and I was just totally in panic, just like being pushed underwater, and you're desperately trying to breathe and you can't. And I felt like my lungs were bursting, and I started going through this blackness and into a tunnel like thing. I still, I felt like I was breathing, but I wasn't. And pretty soon I realized I didn't need to breathe, and it was odd to me, but it was okay. I started moving forward through the tunnel, and I saw down below me, I saw my husband, Don, and my other two sons leaning around it was a lamp pole, and it was raining, and they were crying because I had died. And I wanted to tell them, no, I didn't die. I'm right here. I'm okay. And I just knew that they would be all right. And I don't know how I can tell you that I knew that, but it was like, they're going to be just fine. You can leave them. And so I felt peace at that point, and I started moving on. And I saw off to my left 4 human figures. They weren't angels. They were just human beings. And they looked really concerned for me. And I couldn't figure out, well, why are they so concerned? What's wrong? And We didn't speak or talk. I didn't recognize these people. I don't know who they were. I mean, I feel they could have been distant relatives or somebody that I knew. I don't know, but I didn't recognize them. And my son had died, and I didn't see him. But I went by these four figures looking very concerned for me, and moved on. And then I heard this horrendous noise. I'm sorry, the thought came to me, there is no God. And the thought came to me that all of a sudden this horrendous noise came, like a freight train barreling down on top of me. And I felt a pulling through my chest like a rope going 100 miles an hour, just burning and tearing through my flesh. And it stopped, and I knew that God existed. Now, I had been pretty much an agnostic my entire life, had become a total atheist after my son died, because I was so angry what people would tell me that my son was with Jesus now, and I would scream at them, I'll tell you about your Jesus kills little children. And I did not believe in God. And even if the God did exist, I hated him. I didn't want any part of that. And so that's where I was spiritually. So at this point, knowing that God did exist, I mean, I again can't tell you how I knew that, but beyond anything that I have ever known in my life, I knew that God existed. And I mean, I've always used the example that I've got my hand out here in front of me, and you will never be able to convince me that's not my hand, and it is definitely, there's no doubt. I mean, there's no way. And I felt this tremendous peace, this feeling of just absolutely no death or dying or fear or anything. It was just this euphoric, beautiful place that I was in. I just, again, I think people try to explain that, but can't, and I can't either. It was just a tremendous, tremendous place to be. And then that same thought came to me, there is no heaven. And I started moving toward this brilliance that had some kind of structure holding it back. And I knew that it was heaven, and I knew I was going there. And my desire to be where I was right now was so strong. I've said before that I could have left everything, my husband, my children, everything behind to be in this place. And I don't mean that to sound in a selfish way, but it's just that I knew that's where I was supposed to be, and that this is where I was headed for. And the feeling of knowing that this is the right thing, this is the beautiful, beautiful thing, and headed towards that. And then the thought came, there is no hell, and the same noise and the same tearing through my flesh. And it was as though you're in an elevator and the floor dropped out, and I started falling in just total darkness. And I knew that it was hell. I knew that God hadn't sent me there, that my blasphemy, or I didn't want to have anything to do with God. And it's almost like he honored that. I was like, I hated the even thought of God. And so I was the one that sent myself there, and I knew it. And, God did not send me to hell. I don't believe he sends anybody to hell, but we send ourselves there through our own decisions. And that was a decision I had made, and I'm falling into this total darkness. I feel the pain of burning. I'm screaming and screaming, God, I believe in you now. I'm so sorry. Please save me from this. But it was almost as though God was separated from this place, that he didn't enter in here. It was like I didn't exist anymore, or whatever. I don't know, but it was just falling into this darkness alone, screaming in terror and just absolutely pleading, knowing that I couldn't commit suicide. I couldn't escape in any way. Nobody could have saved me or could, and that not even God was hearing me. But I thankfully was wrong, and God did hear me. I mean, this screaming of God, please save me from this place, and I believe in you, and I know you exist, and I want to go back to that peace, and just pleading. And all of a sudden it stopped, and I started spiraling backwards, back into the tunnel, going back towards the beginning of it. And I felt my spirit enter back into my physical body. And I heard a voice say to me, bring people to me. And then I came through into the surgery room again and woke up, and the doctors were working busily. And So that's where it all began. I was very confused. I felt very confident. I knew what had happened to me. I just wanted somebody else to verify that it had happened to somebody else, or that, it was legitimate or whatever. I just, who do you go to? So I went to my doctor and at first, and I asked him, told him what had happened to me, and he didn't know. He said, well, he said, you can't be under general anesthetic. Your brain is not functioning. You could not have hallucination. You could not have a dream. You couldn't have any of these things. So he explained the disconnection of mental capacities, but he didn't know. I went to a Catholic priest, and he got really mad at me. He said, what do you think happened to you? A miracle? Why you? And he walked out and slammed the door. So, I tried to find some support, but believe me, there was none. But the command that God had given me was to bring people to him. Well, I didn't do that. I had been an atheist. I didn't know anything. I picked up a Bible and it was all Greek to me. Why did they write a New Testament? Wasn't the Old Testament good enough? And, I didn't understand a word in the Bible. It was just awful. And so, I involved myself in church. I prayed daily. I mean, I went to the Catholic church because it was the only one I knew, and the only one that had the doors open in the morning at 6 o'clock. And so I would go there, not necessarily to go to the mass or anything, but just to pray and to be in the place of God. And I one day realized that I needed to learn more. So I left that and went to a evangelical church where they taught about the Bible. And then it started making sense when somebody could explain to me what these things meant, back in the day of Jesus or whatever, and so I believe in that. I believe I'm not a real religious person. I feel like I have a relationship with God and with Jesus Christ. And so in that, I believe that I'm led that way. So I think all of us are. I think religion can hurt people, and has and done some terrible things. And so I'm not religious. I have relationship. and I go to church because I like the fellowship of other believers that think like I do. I believe in the Bible because I can pick it up now and I can just open it and find something in there of wisdom or teaching or good that benefits me. So, and my Bible's all underlined and has all sorts of words in it. And so I find it a very, very knowledgeable book. And I do believe that it has been altered in a lot of ways and to suit mankind's thinking of about God and things. So who knows really what the answer is. But for me, that gave me peace. It gave me wisdom. It gave me the ability to overcome so many things, because I'm not alone in grief. I'm not alone in poverty. I wasn't alone in all those things. So, and I know that now. So my security is secure in that. I think my knowledge of Dr. Greyson came through the International Association of Near-Death Experiences, IANS. Possibly. I got involved with that as well. And I'm not real sure whether the name was given to me or how I did, but I contacted him and we talked, and he started researching me way back in the late 70s, early 80s. And he would send me questionnaires and he would talk to me on the phone. And this relationship went on for 20 years. And, every now and then I would think it was all over and he'd pop up with another questionnaire. So we became, he became a good friend, and he forwarded my book for me. And he's he really given me so much, I don't know, the security of knowing that this really happened, and all of the things that people might say I have a scientific answer for now, apart from mediums and reincarnation and all the other things that are grouped in with paranormal experiences, that are grouped in with near-death experiences. Near-death experiences are very, very different. They're verifiable. They're scientifically backed. There's all sorts of information coming in daily on this phenomena, and it's happened to so many people and so many similarities that go on. And we don't all walk the same path because we're human. But Dr. Greyson, I love him dearly, and thank God for his work. I think God puts in us the will to live. And I think that's what my spirit was when I felt my spirit enter back into my body right before I came back into the surgery room. during my near-death experience. I actually felt a physical thing come into me. And when that spirit entered back into my physical body, I had the will to live. I wanted to live at that point. And until that will to live leaves me, I probably will want to live. So that's how I explain it now. I felt very strongly, I want to live right now. I'm somewhat curious about death. I've been definitely hurt a couple of times in my life where I probably should have died. And what happened was I didn't feel anything. I was in a water ski accident, probably going in a turn so hard that it was probably 80 miles an hour. I hit the water like a brick wall, tore my leg almost completely off. And I didn't feel anything, no pain, nothing, because so when we die, I don't care how horrendous a death you have, you're not going to feel anything. Whatever happens to you physically, I don't know, maybe you go into shock or whatever, but I don't fear that so much. I fear being separated from my family, my sons, my husband, but I'm pretty sure we're all going to the same place. So I feel strongly that I have educated myself to that, and I'm at peace with it. I'm at peace with God, and I'm at peace with my life, and I have my things in order, and now I'm enjoying my life. So someone who's in a terminal illness, when I speak to them, I tell them, that they're loved beyond anything that they could possibly imagine, that death is just walking through a door into something very beautiful. And I try to make sure that they're right with God, and some aren't. Some I had one man one time, and I talked to him about that, and he didn't want anything to do with it, and I had my hand on his oxygen lever up here, and it was like I almost wanted to turn it and say, I'm going to turn this off if you don't if you don't comply here. But I couldn't do that. So I don't know what happened to him, but there is this wonderful thing awaiting us, far more than we could see. Anybody who's had a near-death experience can even explain. We can't. We could tell you it's beyond anything imaginable, but that's what's waiting for all of us. And I don't think people have to fear hell. I think that they need to do their best in their relationship with God, and that's all you could do. I believe that if you open your heart, you ask God into your heart, that He'll guide you, that you will have the ultimate in guidance. I don't worry about saints or angels or anything. I go right to the source, being God. Why go through all the other stuff there? So I speak to Him, and I feel strongly He guides me every day. I feel strongly that when I die, God will be there with me and walk me through that. So, enjoy your life. Don't feel fearful about dying. We're all terminal, every one of us, so you're not alone, and we're all going to go through this together. So that the easiest way to do that is just be informed, be right with God, and that peace will come, and you won't have this fear anymore of death. So that's the best way I could explain it.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.